The Spin-off Podcast Network.
This is Kiwi is back for a brand new season with more inspiring kōrero from special guests including rugby player, father and role model TJ Perenara.
My family bring me joy. Rugby brings me joy too, but it's not the same joy as my family brings me.
And global dancer and choreographer Kirsten Dodgen.
For some reason, people think I'm very intimidating.
Listen to the new season of This is Kiwi, brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in collaboration with KiwiBank. Available now wherever you get your podcasts.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBank.
We weren't just, let's go along and see what kind of wacky stuff they're saying. It was like, this is quite serious, this is newsworthy, this is about political change and the way that this group is going about it.
Talofa lava, I'm Madeleine Chapman, editor of The Spin-off. Welcome to Behind the Story, where I go behind the scenes of a big article on the Spin-off from the week. If you want a weekly rundown of some of the best reads from the Spin-off every Saturday, make sure you sign up to the weekend newsletter. Today I'm talking to Wellington editor Joel MacManus about his long-form feature titled Fear, Hate and a Putrid Stench, inside the Unsilenced anti-trans event. Joel's story is a first-person reported feature of his observations attending the controversial conference in Wellington, where speakers like Brian Tamaki, Posie Parker and sitting MP Tanya Unkovich railed against what they called gender ideology. Trans rights and trans healthcare is a topic that many writers would rather not go near. Anti-trans campaigners can be loud and intense and relentless. It also means that a lot of writing about trans issues is done by trans people themselves and is presented as essays or opinion as opposed to reporting. When I saw an ad for the Unsilenced conference, I asked Joel if he'd be willing to spend his Saturday listening to the speakers and reporting what they said. It was a rare opportunity to simply report on the so-called culture war rather than react to it. So Joel went along and wrote up an incredible feature about what he saw and heard. I wanted to talk to him about what it's like to report in places you know you're not welcome and how he deals with reactions to his work when they become abusive and personal, as they did after the story was published. Here's Joel MacManus on Behind the Story. Hello Joel, welcome to my podcast.
Kia ora, thanks for inviting me on your podcast.
You had quite a big story this week, which was headlined Fear, Hate and a Putrid Stench inside the Unsilenced anti-trans event. That kind of rhymes. Didn't even think about that. This was not a long time coming. This was quite a last-minute request from me to you as our Wellington editor and this event taking place in Wellington. What did you think in terms of your first thoughts? You were very enthusiastic, you said you would pick it up, but what were your first thoughts around how to cover it or concerns or anything like that?
I think immediately I was excited as a journalist. I could see there was potential there for a great story. You know, these anti-trans events have been building around New Zealand. There's always, a couple every year that get counter-protests and get in the media, but I hadn't really seen like a big inside what they're actually talking about kind of piece. So I was quite excited to do that. One of the first things I did after we had that discussion was go read a Hunter S. Thompson story about the Kentucky Derby. He's obviously a legendary gonzo-style journalist who would do similar things to this at a much better level, but he'd go experience things and insert himself into the story, and I figured that was probably going to be the best way to approach this. I was weary too. Obviously it's a very sensitive, difficult topic. It was predictable that there would immediately be backlash from the attendees, but it was also a little bit. I spent a lot of time thinking about, the various ways that a story like this could go wrong. Like we talked about, is this just platforming them? Is this actually helping or hurting? Like, is this, sunlight as a disinfectant, or is this just giving them oxygen? So there were a few kind of things to mull over, but a lot of that came through the writing process, though. First I just had to go to the event and note down everything I saw. I thought there'd be some pretty extreme quotes, and that was kind of the first obvious thing. I wanted to see a little bit about the strategy and mindset of some of the speakers. We had a discussion beforehand about wanting to know how much they talked about gay marriage, whether they were sort of tying the issues together, and they did. And then I just wanted to meet some of the attendees, and we know sort of the names, but who are the regular people that are going? Are they really down the rabbit hole, or are they religious? What are their motivations?
So on the day, you're going to an event that if you had shown up and said, I'm a journalist, I'm here to report on this event, you would probably not have been welcomed with open arms. But at the same time, you are there to do a job, and sometimes it can feel a little bit exaggerated when people talk about journalists going undercover or something like that, and it is just an event. You bought a ticket, you just showed up with your ticket and went in. But did you have any sort of plan in case, for whatever reason, somebody kind of had an issue with your being there?
I think my plan was just to leave as quickly as possible. It's not like I went undercover. I dressed slightly differently to how I would normally dress at work. I had a thin backstory that I hastily came up with for when I was talking to people. I said I was Jack, I was a public servant who was frustrated about having to put pronouns in my email sign-offs. That was about it, but it's not like I really got challenged on that. It was pretty easy to sort of go with it. I was paranoid as I got in, because I realized I'd booked the ticket under my middle name, but it had still gone to my personal email address, which had my name in it. But, I don't think they were regular spin-off readers who would recognise my byline.
So you're in the event, there's a who's who of sort of anti-trans voices scheduled to speak. You're there to take notes. Was there anything that went even beyond what you expected, or was kind of, surprising in a emotional or a human way that you weren't expecting?
Yes to both. I think it surprised me how extreme some of the language was. A lot of the speakers in this space are very sort of aware and very careful with their language. They're like, oh, we're just talking about gender ideology, or, they kind of tiptoe around the words, use dog whistles. Whereas Brian Tamaki, for example, does not. He's talking about needing to do something extreme to change the history of the country. It's quite inciting language. It was interesting. Sort of some of the speakers had sort of this, general homophobia. One quote that I didn't put in there, because I didn't catch the name of the person who said it, but there was one speaker who said, every time I see a rainbow flag, I pray for another flood. And yet there were some speakers who were, lesbians, but were opposed to trans rights. So it's a strange bunch, and they come at it from some with different degrees of extremism, I guess. To your second point, yes, the second to last speaker was a detransitioner named Mel Jeffries. She's Australian, and she had a very powerful story that, everyone in that room connected to, obviously, but I think anyone who heard would feel immense sympathy for, and I think she's been really brave. She had issues with body dysmorphia that was misdiagnosed as gender dysphoria. She lived as a man for a few years from the age of 18 and has since transitioned back and had some procedures that can't be reversed. And that's incredibly hard to hear, and she's really upset about it. And it's this reminder that like this all has real human consequences, right? Some of the speakers there, like you don't know any trans people. You're just hateful or whatever. But some of them have really serious stories, and it can't just be like mocked or dismissed away.
And I think that's, you mentioned Mal's speech when we talked about it after the event was over, and it was I think it was quite a good, almost balance to include, because there are very real, you have your Brian Tamakis and your Posie Parkers who will say the most ridiculous, extreme, hateful things, but there are people who are in agreement with them, but also coming from a very personal place. And I think it was quite good to have that in there, not as and this is why these people are right, but just as a reminder that it's not just these extreme voices who are the only ones in this space. And it's almost like, it's like any other form of extremism. There's a range, and not everyone is at the very end. But that all, we had a lot of chats about in the editing process about how to report it, how to frame it. You mentioned your concerns about when we quote things, are we just letting that person, spreading that person's ideas, or do we need to make sure that people know that this is what these people are saying? And we did land somewhere in the middle. Not everything was included, but definitely a lot more than previous reporting. And I think based on the reaction, that seems to have been the right choice. Do you want to talk through the kind of two different types of response that you got to the story?
Yeah. Sorry. I thought you were setting up to talk about the editing process.
Oh, sorry. Would you like to talk about the editing process?
Sorry, do you need to redo your question? I messed it up.
No, I reckon we can keep this in. This just shows not everyone is prepared for the question. Okay, no, I'll go back to the editing process question. Were there parts that you had originally put in, or ways that you had written up something that ended up getting changed in the editing process or removed, and why?
Yeah, it's a 3,000 word piece, and any piece that long requires a lot of editing. There are sort of a couple different versions in my head that I tried out. I'm often not a huge fan of writing in the first person, but in this case it kind of had to be, especially sort of, not that I was actively arguing against the speakers, but kind of to center it and make it clear that I wasn't just presenting all of their quotes. I had a lot of notes. It was 5 hours, so there was a lot that couldn't run. There's a few speakers I didn't mention, either because I didn't think they were as newsworthy, or it just wasn't the most important stuff to go in the story. We spent a lot of time, both myself and you, working on those first few parts to set it up properly, to understand why we were doing this. We weren't just, let's go along and see what kind of wacky stuff they're saying. It was this is quite serious, this is newsworthy, this is about political change and the way that, this group is going about it. I wanted to get a real understanding, and not just, are they saying extreme quotes, but what do they think, what do they plan, how do they see themselves within the New Zealand political system. So yeah, it kind of had to be set up right, and then and then I just tried to weave the speakers and the attendees sort of throughout. I didn't stick purely to chronological order, so some of them were mixed about, and that was partly because I wanted to end with Mel, who, I mean, the conference probably should have ended with her. It was slightly anticlimactic having to go to other speakers after her. Yeah.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeleine Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
There was a weariness before we even started that was around, as we've mentioned a couple of times, the difference between presenting differences of opinion versus platforming what might be considered harmful opinion. And I think it can be a really difficult thing that's constantly evolving, because there are plenty of topics that it used to be very normal to see opinion columns about them or see quotes about them, and now it would be considered outrageous for somebody to let somebody talk like that in a public platform. And we did talk about that, and that's what all of those sort of steps were, to try and keep it as balanced and sort of show the working of why this was being presented this way. Did you get the response that you expected from the story? I know we both knew what certain people would respond with, but there was definitely a bit of, not apprehension, I guess anticipation of how people who are very supportive of the spin-off and, are very supportive of trans people might have responded to something like this.
Yeah, I think I edited the entire story with a sense of paranoia. At every point you second guess yourself in how something could be interpreted. Am I saying the right thing? Am I wording things the right way? First and foremost, we know that the attendees and some of the anti-trans voices can be very litigious, vexatious, and so everything had to be accurate. I had some handwritten notes, some recorded notes. I kind of cross-checked everything to make sure I was, had not been unfair or inaccurate in any way. But then at the same time, I always had this fear that we would also potentially have backlash from some of the trans allies, pro-trans voices, that again we were quoting hateful things, that this was an unnecessary story perhaps, platforming. That didn't come to pass. We got a lot of emails from some queer organisations, from just individuals, just coming in just saying thank you for doing this, thank you for showing everyone what these people are doing and saying. It actually caught me by surprise. I was like, wow, this was a better response than I expected. And I think that only came because we put so much care into how we set it up and how we framed it.
Yeah, and I think that is potentially a bit of a change in approach from readers as well. Particularly, you have mentioned before about, working at a news organisation during the pandemic, and there was a lot of concern with anti-vax voices and, platforming versus ignoring, and then there was a lot of surprise around the whole country about the sheer volume and force of those parliamentary protests in a way that I think came by surprise because there was not as much of a sense of how loud those voices were in the media. And I think that probably had a bit of a factor in here of it's very hard to tell if voices are getting louder or not if everyone is ignoring them. Sometimes it works, other times you go, actually, probably it might be quite handy for people to know what these people are saying, how they're saying it, how many people they're saying it to. I think the size of the audience was surprising to me. I thought that there would be more people at this conference rather than a couple of hundred. And yet they can be very loud. I'm quite interested in their response to the story, because they sure did have a response.
Yeah, I mean, before I even woke up, my Twitter mentions were full of abuse, but mostly playing the man, not the ball, which is the best possible result. You know, there wasn't a lot of "you got this wrong" or "this was inaccurate," or, you know, there were a few people who accused me of that, but I was fairly comfortable with the accuracy of everything we had there. It took off much faster than I expected. Quite early in the morning, the writer and comedian Graham Linehan, who's a pretty big anti-trans voice in the UK, had jumped on it, had tagged me and said it was like a Nazi reporting on a meeting of the Jews.
Yes, reasonable first analogy to make.
Yeah, I won't comment on that. But yeah, there was you know, so there was a lot of that sort of stuff. I got just a lot of random personal abuse, people thinking they were being very clever, playing with my, you know, playground insults based on my last name, that sort of stuff. I had a few nice texts from people just being like, "Watch out there." Kind of was like, I don't think people are like hiding around the corner looking to bash me for this article, but who knows?
I mean, you're laughing about it, and I have also had moments of writing particular things that seem to catch certain crowds on Twitter, or maybe just even a certain person, and they go after you. And I think it is quite funny. Like I said, "Oh, you've got some new group chat names," because all of my group chat nicknames are just random insults that people have thrown at me after reading one of my articles. And I find them quite funny. Not everyone does. Like I certainly, even within our own office, I would not, this was not an assignment that I would have just chucked out to the room for somebody to pick up. I think I did ask you to do it, one, because you're in Wellington, but two, because I know the types of stories that you like to write and are interested in. And I also thought you probably wouldn't get too bogged down by what was going to be an inevitable, quite hateful response from the speakers and the people there and anyone who agrees with them. Has that ever gotten to you? Like, have you ever sort of found that you would rather just silence than response, or is it sort of, if you're gonna enjoy the good, you're gonna get the shit sometimes?
It has. I think part of being a writer is being very self-critical, right? You do that in the editing process. I think anytime you have a big story, there's a point at least halfway through writing where you're like, "This is the worst thing anyone's ever done."
Don't know what you're talking about.
And so, yeah, I mean, like any little, I definitely used to be someone who would like cotton onto criticism quite hard and beat myself up for it if I had a story that, I felt I'd messed up, or, even just didn't do as well as I could or something, or I just thought people were upset with. I think just with a bit more experience, you grow a bit more of a thick skin. And it wasn't unexpected with this one, you know. In fact, it was almost half the reward. It was like, oh yeah, this is going to fire some people up. I'm also aware, and like not to be too self-serious or anything, but, you know, I'm kind of aware that I'm a relatively large cis white guy, and that comes with a little bit of, you know, call it privilege, but there's a little bit more safety there and a little bit, you know, less potential for abuse and targeting than perhaps some other reporters might face, and I thought about that too. A few people tried to have a go at my appearance or whatever. You know, not that I'm necessarily like the most confident person or anything, but I just kind of I could see how that could just get really, really harsh if they had a different target.
Yeah. And I think that is also part of, there are particular stories that we talk about in the office, or whether it's a column or something, and sometimes I go, well, I'll pick this one up because I feel like in my position and with my job title, one, it might hold a little bit more weight for some people, and two, it might cause people, which is a little bit ridiculous, but it does cause people to sometimes hesitate just a little bit in whether they try and, I don't know, bully you or something like that. And so there are stories that sometimes you go, actually, sometimes the most appropriate person isn't maybe the first person you think of, it's the person who is best placed to kind of withstand whatever might come after it. And I think that's great. I think it's great that you were willing to do a story like this, and I think there were definitely a lot of people who probably clicked on your profile intending to see a certain type of reporter or a certain type of story or a certain type of look, and got something very different, and then kind of went, oh, okay, and then just kind of resorted to, some weak insults or something like that. So, yeah, I think that is also, it's great. I was very glad that you wanted to do the story, and I think everyone has been really glad to see, I guess, other reporters reporting on some things. There are some things that people don't really want to go near, and I think things around trans rights has become very this opinion versus this opinion, and people are very weary of kind of wading in sometimes because of that response. And so you doing like a very just clearly reported, not detached, but definitely observational rather than experiential piece has gone a long way for a lot of people. So very glad you picked up the story. And it made sense to pick up the story because you are the Wellington editor, and we are recording this podcast on the road in Wellington, which is very exciting. But I am interested in how you see it fitting into your Wellington content in terms of jumping from this quite intense, kind of controversial story to whatever you did next, which was also published this week.
I think after a quite heavy story like that, it's nice to have a bit of a release valve and just do something entirely different. So the story I did the next day after that was published was a review of Goth to a Flame, which is Jermaine Clement and Johnny Bra's new musical comedy duo, which weirdly, although it was like it was a theatre review, it still felt a little bit dangerous just because Jermaine Clement and Flight of the Conchords are a sacred cow in Wellington. They're our favourite sons. And I was semi-critical of the show. I did think there was gold. Like I'm a big Flight of the Conchords fan, and there's a lot of the same level of humour, and I was like, this could be awesome. But I didn't think they were very rehearsed, and I think the show was still pretty underdeveloped. But I do think that pretty soon it's going to be awesome.
Well, you can read both the 3,000-word first-person reported feature from Joel's time at Unsilenced, and you can also read his, as he says, semi-critical review of Goth to a Flame, both on the spinoff.co.nz right now. Thank you very much, Joel, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
That was Wellington editor Joel MacManus. I'll be back next week with another spin-off writer and another spin-off yarn. Thanks for listening.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, senior writer at The Spin-Off. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.